The Montana Territory air, even in the late spring of 1888, bit with a raw, untamed chill as Elias Thorne guided his tired mare, Bess, along the rutted track. Each plodding hoofbeat was a punctuation mark in the long, solitary sentence of his journey. His own ranch in the Dakotas had withered under drought and debt, a slow, agonizing demise that had stripped him down to this one last gamble, a mail-order bride, a woman named Elara Vance, and the promise of a shared life on her family's homestead nestled somewhere in the vast, unyielding landscape ahead. He clutched the worn letter in his pocket, its creases softened by countless readings. Elara's words, penned in a neat, determined hand, spoke of fertile land, a sturdy cabin, and a longing for partnership. They were words that had become his compass, his beacon against the encroaching darkness of failure. He was a man of the earth, calloused hands his testimony, but loneliness had become a constant, unwelcome companion. He pictured Elara, perhaps strong and capable, like the women he'd known growing up, her face weathered by the sun, her eyes kind. He wasn't looking for grand romance, just a steady presence, a hand to hold in the quiet hours, someone to build a future with, side by side. The track narrowed, winding through a stand of sambar pines before opening onto a small, neglected clearing. A cabin stood there, smaller than he'd imagined, its logs grayed and weathered, the porch sagging like a weary sigh. A tendril of unease curled in his gut. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life, only an unnerving stillness that seemed to press down from the immense, indifferent sky. He dismounted, his legs stiff, his heart thudding a little faster now, not with anticipation, but with a creeping dread. He called out, "Hello? Miss Vance?" Only the whisper of the wind through the long grass answered him. As he approached the cabin, his gaze fell upon a patch of freshly turned earth near a gnarled cottonwood, a crude wooden cross hammered into the soil at its head. The dread solidified into a cold, hard stone in his chest. The cabin door creaked open before he could reach it, and a girl stepped out, no more than 13, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes, startlingly blue and fierce, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She held a rusty hoe like a weapon. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice thin but unwavering. Elias took off his hat, his throat suddenly dry. "Elias Thorne." I was corresponding with Miss Elara Vance." The girl's gaze didn't soften. "Elara was my sister," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the name. "She died. Fever." A week past the word struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. He felt the ground shift beneath him, the carefully constructed edifice of his hopes crumbling into dust. Dead. The woman who was to be his wife, his partner, his new beginning, was gone before he'd even arrived. He looked at the raw grave, then back at the girl, her small frame braced against a grief too large for her years. And then, from the shadowy doorway behind her, other faces began to appear, small, pale, and apprehensive. 1, 2, 3, more. A boy of about 11, clutching a piece of wood. A girl with wide, startled eyes. A smaller child, no more than 5, peeking from behind the older girl's skirt. And then toddlers, twins, it looked like, their faces tear-streaked and wary. 7 of them. 7 hollow-eyed children, standing on the precipice of an abyss, with nothing between them and the harsh Montana wilderness but this defiant girl and a cabin that looked as if it might surrender to the next strong wind. Elias stared, the letter in his pocket suddenly feeling like a cruel mockery. He had come seeking a bride, a partner to help him rebuild his life. Instead, he had found a grave, and 7 orphans staring back at him with the silent, accusing eyes of utter desolation. The silence that followed Martha Vance's stark pronouncement stretched taut, broken only by the fretful cry of one of the younger children, a sound that seemed to amplify the desolation of the scene. Elias felt as though the wind had been knocked from him, his mind struggling to reconcile the hopeful image he'd carried for months with the brutal reality before him. Elara Vance, the name that had symbolized a new chapter, was now just a name on a crude wooden cross. He looked at the children, truly looked at them, and saw not just their number, but the individual shadows of fear and loss that clung to each one. Martha, the eldest, stood ramrod straight, her young face set in lines of premature responsibility, her knuckles white where she gripped the hoe. The boy beside her, Samuel, Elias would later learn, watched him with an unnerving stillness, his eyes old and knowing. Lydia, a girl of perhaps 9, hid partly behind Samuel, her suspicion a palpable force. And then the smaller ones, Caleb, looking frail and pale, Hannah, who sniffled quietly, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, and the twins, Josiah and Micah, clinging to each other, their round faces mirroring a shared bewilderment. His carefully laid plans, the modest dreams he'd nurtured on the long journey, had evaporated like morning mist. What was he to do? He was a rancher, his skills suited to wresting a living from stubborn soil, not to tending a flock of bereaved children. His own pockets were nearly empty, his future already a question mark before this devastating revelation. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over him. He could turn Bess around, ride away from this place of sorrow and unforeseen burden. No one would blame him. He had no legal tie, no obligation. It was a tragedy, yes, but not his tragedy to bear. The thought, however, as soon as it formed, brought with it a surprising stab of something akin to shame. He looked at Martha's unwavering gaze, at the vulnerable tremor in Hannah's lip, at the sheer, overwhelming need that radiated from this small, huddled group. He remembered his own childhood, marked by a quiet loneliness after his mother passed, the feeling of being adrift in a world too large and indifferent. These children were more than adrift, they were shipwrecked. Later that evening, after a meager meal cobbled together from the last of Elias's supplies and the children's dwindling stores, mostly dried beans and a little flour, he sat on the sagging porch step, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the Montana sky. The children were inside, huddled together for warmth and comfort on a collection of worn blankets on the floor. He had learned more from Martha, her words spare but laden with grief. Their parents had died the previous winter, victims of a lung fever that had swept through the area. Elara, only 19 herself, had taken on the care of her siblings, writing the letter to him in a desperate bid to secure not just a husband for herself, but a protector and provider for her family. She had been their last hope, and now she too was gone. The weight of their situation pressed down on him. The cabin was drafty, the food scarce. Winter, though months away, was a predator that always lurked in these northern lands. He thought of the town, Miles City, a good 2 days' ride away. What would they find there? An orphanage? Separation? The idea of these children, already traumatized by loss, being scattered to the winds, was unbearable. The night was long and filled with the sounds of the wilderness, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of unseen creatures in the grass, the sighing of the wind. Elias barely slept, his mind a turmoil of conflicting emotions. He saw again the hopeful words in Elara's letter, felt the ghost of her determination. She had been fighting for these children. How could he, a stranger who had journeyed on the strength of her plea, simply walk away from the legacy of that fight? He was no saint, just an ordinary man battered by his own failures, but something in the raw courage of Martha, in the trusting gaze of little Hannah when he'd managed a clumsy smile, resonated deep within him. He was a man who understood hardship, who knew the ache of loss. He wasn't a father, had never imagined himself as one, but he knew what it was to be alone and in need. As dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and pale golds, a fragile kind of resolve began to form within him. It wasn't a grand, heroic decision, but a quiet, stubborn settling in his soul. He couldn't fix what was broken, couldn't bring back their sister or their parents, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could offer them a shield against the worst of the storm. He rose, his joints stiff, and walked towards the cabin. The children were stirring. Martha was already up, trying to coax a spark from the embers in the hearth. Elias cleared his throat. "Martha," he said, his voice raspy from disuse and the night air. She looked up, her expression wary, expectant. The other children, sensing a moment of significance, fell silent. I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words feeling heavy and momentous. "I'll stay. For now, at least. We'll figure this out together." Martha stared at him, her fierce blue eyes searching his face. He saw a flicker of disbelief, then a tiny, almost imperceptible easing of the tension in her shoulders. She didn't smile, didn't offer words of gratitude, just gave a curt nod. But in that nod, Elias sensed the first fragile thread of a connection, a reluctant acknowledgement that perhaps, in this stranger, they might not find another abandonment. The for now hung in the air, a concession to his own uncertainty, but deep down, a part of him knew that the decision, once made, had taken root. He had stepped across a threshold, and the path ahead, though daunting and unknown, was now one he would walk with 7 small shadows trailing in his wake. The weight of responsibility felt immense, but strangely, it was accompanied by a flicker of purpose, a feeling he hadn't known in a long, long time. The Montana wilderness stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, but for the first time since his arrival, Elias Thorne didn't feel entirely alone. The days that followed Elias's decision settled into a rhythm of relentless toil and tentative adjustment. The homestead, neglected during Elara's illness and the children's subsequent grief, demanded immediate and Herculean effort. The cabin roof leaked in 3 places, the chinking between the logs had crumbled, and the small plot intended for a garden was choked with weeds. Elias, accustomed to the singular focus of ranch work, now found his energies divided between the pressing needs of survival and the equally pressing, though far more delicate, task of earning the trust of 7 wary children. Martha, though still reserved, became his reluctant lieutenant, her practical knowledge of the homestead invaluable. She knew where Elara had stored the few remaining seeds, which tools were least broken, and the habits of the local wildlife, both helpful and harmful. Samuel, or Sam as he preferred, was a quiet observer, often found whittling small figures from scraps of wood, his fingers surprisingly deft. Elias, remembering his own boyhood fascination with a pocket knife, found a moment one evening to show Sam a simpler way to carve a bird's wing. The boy didn't say much, but the next day, Elias saw him practicing the new technique, a faint line of concentration etched between his brows. Lydia remained the most suspicious, her eyes tracking Elias's every move, as if expecting him to vanish or reveal some hidden, nefarious motive. Caleb, the frail one, seemed to cling to Martha's shadow, while Hannah, after that first tentative smile, began to offer Elias small, shy glances, sometimes even a whispered "Good morning, Mr. Thorne." The twins, Josiah and Micah, were a whirlwind of chaotic energy, their needs immediate and their understanding of the family's precarious situation non-existent. They were, in their own way, a reminder of the innocence that Elias felt compelled to protect. Feeding 7 extra mouths on his dwindling resources was the most immediate challenge. He rationed his remaining flour and bacon, supplementing their meager diet with rabbits he managed to snare and fish he caught in a nearby creek. He taught Martha and Sam how to set snares, how to identify edible greens. Every small success, a full cookpot, a mended tear in a worn shirt, felt like a victory against encroaching despair. The work on the cabin was arduous. He patched the roof with salvaged shingles and mud, rechinked the logs with a mixture of clay and grass, and repaired the broken shutters. The children, initially hesitant, began to help in small ways, gathering firewood, carrying water from the creek, weeding the garden plot under Martha's stern supervision. These shared tasks, born of necessity, began to weave the first threads of a fragile tapestry of belonging. One afternoon, while Elias was struggling to fix a wobbly leg on the cabin's only table, little Hannah approached him, clutching a crudely made doll with yarn hair. She stood silently beside him until he looked up. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, holding out the doll. "Her name is Elara. Can you make her a tiny chair?" Elias looked at the doll, then at Hannah's earnest, upturned face. His heart constricted. He wasn't a carpenter, much less a toy maker, but he couldn't refuse. He found a small block of wood and, with his jackknife, slowly, clumsily, carved a miniature chair. It was rough, uneven, but when he presented it to Hannah, her face lit up with a radiant smile that felt like sunshine after a long winter. She hugged the doll, then, to Elias's immense surprise, threw her arms around his legs in a quick, fierce hug before scampering away. The brief contact sent a warmth spreading through him, an unfamiliar sensation that settled deep in his chest. But the challenges were not just internal. Word of the Vance children's plight, and the unexpected presence of a strange man at their homestead, eventually trickled into Miles City. One dusty afternoon, a buggy rattled into the clearing. A stern-faced man in a dark suit, Mr. Silas Blackwood, a prominent town elder and self-appointed guardian of public morals and finances, stepped out. He surveyed the rustic scene with unconcealed disapproval, his gaze lingering on the children, then settling sharply on Elias. "Elias Thorne." Blackwood's voice was as dry as the prairie dust. "I've heard about your arrangement here. The good people of Miles City are concerned for these children. Orphans, you understand. They belong in the county orphanage, where they can receive proper care and schooling." Elias felt a surge of defensiveness. "They're being cared for, Mr. Blackwood. They have food, shelter. Blackwood gestured dismissively at the cabin. "This is hardly adequate. And you, Mr. Thorne, what claim do you have on them? You're not kin." The threat was clear. Blackwood represented the cold, impersonal hand of officialdom, a force that could shatter the fragile family they were beginning to build. The fear in Martha's eyes as she listened from the doorway spurred Elias. "I made a promise," he said, his voice low but firm. "I intend to keep it." Blackwood sniffed. "Sentiment is admirable, Mr. Thorne, but it doesn't fill bellies or prepare children for a respectable life. I'll be looking into this matter further." With a final, disapproving glance, he climbed back into his buggy and departed, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a heavy sense of foreboding. The brief encounter solidified Elias's resolve. These children were not just a responsibility he had stumbled into, they were becoming his. And he would fight for them. The shadow of Mr. Blackwood's visit lingered over the homestead, adding a new layer of urgency to their daily struggles. Elias knew that looking into this matter further was not an idle threat. The thought of the children being torn from the only home they'd ever known, separated and institutionalized, spurred him to work with even greater intensity. But nature, too, had its own timetable of trials. Caleb, the quiet, 7-year-old, fell ill. It started with a cough, then a fever that left him weak and listless. Fear, sharp and cold, gripped Elias. He knew little of doctoring, and Miles City, with its physician, was a long, arduous journey, especially with a sick child. He remembered the lung fever that had taken the children's parents, and a terrible dread settled upon him. Martha, her face pale with worry, proved a surprisingly capable nurse, her touch gentle as she bathed Caleb's forehead with cool water. Elias sat with the boy through long nights, listening to his labored breathing, offering sips of water, his heart aching with a helplessness he hadn't felt since watching his own crops wither under a relentless sun. He brewed willow bark tea, a remedy his mother had used for fevers, and prayed with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed. During those anxious days, the other children were subdued, their usual chatter replaced by worried whispers. Even Lydia seemed to forget her suspicion of Elias, her eyes often fixed on the closed door of the small room where Caleb lay. The shared crisis forged a new kind of bond, an unspoken understanding that they were all in this together, reliant on each other and on this quiet, determined man who had, against all odds, chosen to stay. The financial strain was relentless. Elias's meager savings were almost gone. He had hoped to use what little he had to buy a milk cow, perhaps some chickens, to provide a steady source of food. Now, every penny was hoarded for essentials. The turning point came when he realized they were nearly out of flour and salt. There was no choice. With a heavy heart, he led Bess, his faithful mare, the companion of so many lonely years, towards the trail to Miles City. He would have to sell her. It felt like selling a part of himself, but the image of Caleb's feverish face, the memory of Hannah's trusting hug, outweighed his own sense of loss. Martha watched him go, her expression unreadable, but as he rode away, he saw her turn and look at Bess's empty patch of grass, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. The trip to town was grim. He got less for Bess than he'd hoped, the horse trader sensing his desperation. The money, clutched tightly in his hand, felt like a poor exchange for such loyalty. He bought flour, salt, a little sugar, and crucially, some quinine, hoping it might help Caleb if the fever didn't break soon. He also encountered Mrs. Agnes Miller, the proprietor of the general store, a woman known for her sharp tongue but also, Elias had heard, a sometimes hidden kindness. She observed him with shrewd eyes as he made his purchases. "Heard you're looking after the Vance brood," she said, her tone neutral. "Quite a handful, I'd wager. Elias nodded, not trusting himself to speak much. Silas Blackwood's got his nose in it, she continued, bagging his goods. Thinks they belong in the orphanage. Says it's for their own good. Elias met her gaze. Their own good is staying together. In their own home. Mrs. Miller paused, then added an extra apple to his bag. Some folks see things differently, Mr. Thorne. But courage counts for something in this country. Her words, though brief, were a small comfort. He returned to the homestead, weary but resolute, to find that Caleb's fever had, by some small miracle, finally broken. The boy was weak, but his eyes were clear, and he managed a faint smile when Elias sat beside him. The relief that washed over the small cabin was immense. Martha's shoulders visibly relaxed, and even Lydia offered Elias a small, almost shy, nod of acknowledgement. That evening, as he watched the children share the fresh bread made from the new flour, a profound sense of paternal protectiveness swelled within him. He had sold his horse, his last link to his old life, for these children. He had faced down illness and his own crippling self-doubt. He was no longer just staying for now. He was their guardian, their protector. And Mr. Blackwood, or anyone else who tried to take them, would find him a formidable obstacle. He was beginning to understand that fatherhood wasn't just about blood, it was about commitment, about sacrifice, about a love that grew in the fertile soil of shared hardship and unwavering presence. With Caleb's recovery, a fragile sense of optimism began to blossom on the homestead. The near tragedy had stripped away more layers of distrust, revealing a growing affection and interdependence. The children, sensing Elias's unwavering commitment, began to open up in their own ways. Sam would occasionally present Elias with a newly whittled animal, his silent offering a token of respect. Lydia, though still cautious, started asking him questions about his past, about the Dakotas, her curiosity slowly overcoming her wariness. Hannah was now his constant shadow, her small hand often finding its way into his larger one. Even the twins, Josiah and Micah, began to see him not as a stranger, but as a fixture in their small world, someone who could be relied upon for a hoisted shoulder ride or a patient untangling of their latest mischief. The garden, under Elias and Martha's combined efforts, was showing promise. Green shoots of beans, squash, and corn pushed through the dark earth, symbols of their tenacity and hope for a more plentiful future. Elias taught the older children how to repair fences, how to read the signs of the weather. He was no teacher in the formal sense, but he shared the practical knowledge gleaned from a life lived close to the land. They worked together, ate together, and in the evenings, huddled around the small fire, Elias would sometimes tell stories, tales of his own boyhood, or adventures he'd read in dime novels, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He saw smiles on their faces, heard their laughter, rare and precious sounds that soothed the rough edges of his own past disappointments. One evening, as he was mending a harness by the fading light, little Hannah climbed onto his lap, a common occurrence now. She snuggled against his chest and, with a sigh of contentment, said, "You smell like pine trees and safe, Mr. Thorne." The simple, heartfelt words struck him with an unexpected force. He held her a little tighter, his throat thick with emotion. Pine trees and safe. It wasn't the life he had envisioned when he'd first set out for Montana, but it was becoming a life of profound meaning. However, the specter of Silas Blackwood had not disappeared. True to his word, he paid another visit, this time unannounced. He found Elias and the older children working in the garden, their clothes patched, their hands stained with earth. Blackwood's lip curled in disdain. "Still persisting in this folly, Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The children are thinner than when I last saw them. This is no life for them." Martha stepped forward, her chin high. "We have food, Mr. Blackwood." "And we're together in squalor," Blackwood retorted. "I've spoken with the circuit judge. He agrees that their welfare needs to be formally assessed. There will be a hearing." Elias straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "A hearing? On what grounds?" "On the grounds that they are orphans in need of proper care, which you, an unrelated, impoverished drifter, are clearly unable to provide," Blackwood stated coldly. "The orphanage in Helena is expecting them." The words "orphanage in Helena" sent a chill through Elias and a visible wave of fear across the children's faces. Helena was a world away, a place of unknown terrors. The thought of them being sent there, separated and alone, was a nightmare. Elias felt a cold anger rise within him. "These children have a home," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They have me. And I will not let you take them." Blackwood merely smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "Your sentiments are irrelevant, Thorn. The law will decide. The hearing is in Miles City." 2 weeks from Thursday he turned on his heel and left, the dust from his departing buggy settling like a pall over their small patch of cultivated earth. The news of the hearing galvanized Elias. He knew he couldn't fight Blackwood's influence with eloquent speeches or legal knowledge he didn't possess. His only weapons were the truth of their lives together and the undeniable bond that had formed between him and these 7 children. He had to make the judge see, feel, what he saw and felt every day. The 2 weeks leading up to the hearing were fraught with a mixture of dread and determined preparation. Elias knew he had to present the best possible case, not just for himself, but for the children whose fate hung in the balance. He spoke plainly with Martha and Sam about what was happening, about the possibility that Mr. Blackwood might succeed. Martha's face was grim, but her eyes held a familiar fire. "He won't take us, Mr. Thorn," she declared, though her voice held a slight tremor. "This is our home. You're our family now." The word family resonated deeply with Elias. It was a truth he had come to embrace with his whole being. He made the difficult journey to Miles City, not to confront Blackwood, but to seek out anyone who might listen with an open mind. He found Mrs. Miller at the general store. He explained the situation, his words unadorned, heartfelt. Blackwood sees them as a burden on the county, or perhaps an opportunity to appear charitable by packing them off, Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. He doesn't see them as children who've already lost too much. He doesn't see what we're building. Mrs. Miller listened intently, a usual sharp demeanor softened by a thoughtful expression. "Silas Blackwood has influence, Mr. Thorn," she said quietly. "But truth has a way of shining through, even in a dusty courtroom. You speak from the heart." Make sure the judge hears that her quiet encouragement was a small balm to his frayed nerves. Back at the homestead, an unexpected ally emerged. An early, unseasonable blizzard swept down from the north, trapping them in the cabin for 3 days. The wind howled like a tormented spirit, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door. Supplies, though more plentiful now thanks to the garden's first harvests and careful management, were still finite. It was a true test of their resilience and unity. Elias, with Martha and Sam's help, kept the fire roaring, rationed their food, and ensured the younger children stayed warm and occupied. They told stories, sang songs, and huddled together against the cold and the fear. During a lull in the storm, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep snow. It was Jed Olson, their nearest neighbor, a taciturn old rancher who lived a few miles down the creek. Elias had only exchanged brief nods with him previously. Olson, his face ruddy from the cold, carried a sack over his shoulder. "Heard you folks might be snowed in tight," he grumbled, stomping snow from his boots on the porch. "Brought some smoked meat. And my missus sent over some fresh-baked bread." Elias was taken aback by the unexpected kindness. "Mr. Olson, we don't know how to thank you." Olson just shrugged. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's the way of it out here. Heard about that Blackwood fella too? Man's got ice in his veins. You tell that judge those young uns belong right here." The simple act of solidarity from a near stranger bolstered Elias's spirits immeasurably. It was a reminder that they weren't entirely alone in their fight. The day of the hearing dawned cold and grey. Elias, dressed in his cleanest, mended shirt, helped the children prepare. They were all subdued, their faces scrubbed, their patched clothes as neat as Martha could make them. The journey to Miles City in their rickety wagon was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The courtroom was small and crowded, mostly with curious townspeople. Silas Blackwood sat at a table near the front, looking smug and confident. Judge Harriman, a stern-looking man with weary eyes, presided. Blackwood presented his case first, painting a picture of neglect and unsuitability, emphasizing Elias's lack of kinship and financial means. He spoke of the opportunities awaiting the children at the Helena orphanage, proper schooling, religious instruction, a chance to be adopted into decent families. Elias listened, his heart sinking. Blackwood's words, though twisted, sounded plausible, logical. When it was Elias's turn to speak, he stood before Judge Harriman, his hands clasped tightly behind his back to still their trembling. He was not an eloquent man, and the formal setting was intimidating. He looked at the children, their 7 pairs of eyes fixed on him, full of trust and trepidation. That gave him strength. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a little shaky at first, "I ain't got fancy words like Mr. Blackwood. I'm just a plain man. When I came to this territory, I was expecting to meet Miss Elara Vance, to marry her. I found her, gone. And I found these children, her brothers and sisters, alone and scared." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood says I can't provide. It's true we ain't rich. We live simple. But we have a roof over our heads, one I mended with my own hands, with their help. We have food in our bellies, from a garden we planted together. We have warmth from a fire we all helped to feed." He looked directly at the judge. "He says I'm not kin. By blood, no, that's true. But kinship, Your Honor, it ain't always about blood. It's about showing up. It's about staying when it's hard. It's about protecting them, teaching them, caring for them when they're sick, rejoicing with them when they're well. These children, they ain't a burden to me. They're my family." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Harriman looked at Elias, then at the children, his expression unreadable. Blackwood scoffed audibly. "Sentiment, Your Honor. Noble, perhaps, but hardly a basis for legal guardianship." Judge Harriman then did something unexpected. He looked towards the children. "Martha Vance," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Would you like to say anything?" Martha, pale but resolute, stood up. She clutched Hannah's hand tightly. "Mr. Thorne tells the truth, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear despite her nervousness. "Our sister Elara, she wanted someone to help us, to keep us together. Mr. Thorne, he came, and he stayed. He works hard. He's kind to us. He keeps us safe. Before he came, we were scared all the time. Now we have a home. We don't want to go to no orphanage. We want to stay with Mr. Thorne." Then, little Hannah, emboldened by Martha, piped up, her small voice carrying in the silence, "He makes good chairs for dolls, too." A few stifled chuckles rippled through the courtroom, easing the tension slightly. Judge Harriman then called on Mrs. Agnes Miller, who had quietly entered and stood at the back. To Elias's surprise, she stepped forward. "Judge," Mrs. Miller said, her voice firm. "I've seen this man, Elias Thorne. He's traded his last horse for food for these children. I've seen the children themselves. They're cleaner and healthier now than when they were first orphaned. They look to him. And Jed Olson, a man of good standing, tells me Thorne's a hard worker and a decent neighbor. Sometimes, Judge, what looks right on paper ain't what's right in the heart. These children have found a father, even if he didn't set out to be one-inch." Silas Blackwood looked furious, but Judge Harriman held up a hand for silence. He looked at Elias, then at the children, then back at Blackwood. He was quiet for a long moment, the fate of this unconventional family resting in his hands. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge finally said, his voice grave. "The law provides for the welfare of orphans. And welfare is not merely about sustenance, but about stability, affection, and a sense of belonging. I have heard compelling testimony today. While Mr. Thorne's circumstances may be modest, his commitment is evident. And the children themselves have spoken." He paused, then delivered his ruling. "It is the decision of this court that the Vance children shall remain in the custody of Mr. Elias Thorne, under the informal guardianship of this court, which will review the situation periodically." Petition denied. A collective gasp, then a murmur of approval, went through the courtroom. Elias felt his knees go weak with relief. He looked at the children. Martha was crying silently, Sam was actually smiling, and Hannah was beaming. Silas Blackwood, his face a mask of thunder, gathered his papers and stalked out without a word. Elias simply stood there, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and a love so profound it almost buckled him. They had won. Their family, forged in hardship and sealed by a judge's decree, was safe. The journey back to the homestead was a stark contrast to the tense, silent ride into town. The rickety wagon seemed lighter, the air clearer, the future, though still undoubtedly challenging, now shone with the bright promise of togetherness. Laughter, hesitant at first, then bubbling freely, filled the small space. Hannah chatted excitedly about the judge and Mrs. Miller, while Sam quietly showed Elias a perfectly carved miniature horse, a symbol, perhaps, of a new beginning. Martha, seated beside Elias on the wagon bench, leaned her head against his shoulder for a brief, poignant moment, a silent acknowledgement of all they had overcome. Back at the cabin, a sense of quiet celebration settled over them. There was no grand feast, no fanfare, just the deep, abiding comfort of being home, together, their bond officially recognized, their future their own to build. Elias watched them that evening, the 7 children who had so unexpectedly and completely claimed his heart. He had come to Montana seeking a wife, a partner to ease his loneliness and share the burdens of a hard life. He had found something infinitely more profound, more demanding, and ultimately, more rewarding. He had found a family. Years passed, marked by the steady rhythm of seasons and the daily acts of love and labor that bind a family together. The homestead, under Elias's patient hand and with the growing help of the children, began to flourish. The cabin was expanded, room by room, its walls echoing with the sounds of study, play, and shared meals. The garden yielded bountiful harvests. A few chickens clucked in a newly built coop, and eventually, a gentle milk cow grazed in the pasture where Bess had once stood. Elias never replaced Bess in his heart, but the presence of new life, of growing things, eased the old ache. The children grew, each in their own way reflecting the strength and resilience they had learned. Martha became a capable young woman, her early fierceness softened by a quiet wisdom, her bond with Elias one of deep mutual respect and affection. Sam's skilled hands found purpose in carpentry, his creation sturdy and beautiful, much like the man who had taught him to value honest work. Lydia's spirited nature found an outlet in learning, her quick mind devouring every book Elias could procure. Caleb grew stronger, his early frailty overcome by fresh air and loving care. Hannah, always expressive, filled their home with song and laughter. And the twins, Josiah and Micah, grew into strapping lads, their boundless energy now channeled into the demands of the growing homestead. Elias Thorne was no longer the struggling rancher, he was a respected man in the slowly growing community, known for his quiet integrity and the remarkable family he had raised. Mr. Blackwood had long since faded into an unpleasant memory, and Judge Harriman, on his periodic informal visits, always left with a smile, witnessing the undeniable success of his early, compassionate ruling. Mrs. Miller became a regular visitor, her sharp tongue often delivering sage advice wrapped in gruff affection. Jed Olson and his wife remained steadfast friends. One crisp autumn evening, many years later, Elias sat on the expanded porch, watching the vibrant hues of a Montana sunset paint the sky. His hair was now streaked with gray, his face deeply lined by sun and time, but his eyes held a profound contentment. Some of his children were now grown, beginning to forge their own paths, yet they always returned, drawn back to the warmth and love of the home he had built for them, the home they had built together. Hannah, now a young woman with her father's kind eyes, sat beside him, her own child playing at their feet. "You did good, Pa," she said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder, just as Martha had done all those years ago in the wagon. Elias smiled, a deep, quiet satisfaction warming him from the inside out. He had arrived in Montana a man seeking a bride, his future uncertain, his heart shadowed by past failures. He had found no bride, but he had discovered a love vaster than any he could have imagined, a purpose that had redefined his very existence. He had become the father these 7 children wished for, the father they needed. And in return, they had given him the greatest gift of all, they had made him whole. They had become the family his solitary heart had always, unknowingly, yearned for. his legacy wouldn't be in acres owned or fortunes made, but in the unwavering love of this chosen family, a testament to the extraordinary power of an ordinary man's courageous heart. Mid-script channel interjection reminder: this is where a casual, friendly, direct channel interjection could be placed, e.g., "Hey folks, just taking a quick pause in Elias's incredible story." If you're finding his journey as moving as I am, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on more tales of resilience and hope. We've got plenty more coming your way. Alright, let's get back to Montana and see how Elias and his unexpected family carve out their future. End script channel interjection reminder: this is where a final channel interjection would go, e.g., "And that's the story of Elias Thorne and the 7 children who taught him the true meaning of fatherhood." What an incredible journey of love, sacrifice, and finding family in the most unexpected of places. What part of Elias's story touched you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our other historical dramas right here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.